On March 22, 1848, census taker William Grohse rode his horse up the narrow, treacherous trail leading to Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee. What he encountered in those remote Appalachian hollows would haunt him for the rest of his life and puzzle historians for the next 175 years. The family before him defied every racial category he'd been trained to recognize. They possessed dark olive-toned skin that seemed Mediterranean in origin, yet their facial features were distinctly European. High cheekbones, aquiline noses, sometimes piercing blue or green eyes that seemed to glow against their dusky complexions. They spoke English, but it was unlike any English Grohse had ever heard. Archaic phrases mixed with unfamiliar words that sounded vaguely Romance, or perhaps Middle Eastern. When he asked about their origins, they claimed to be Portuguese. But Grohse knew there were no Portuguese settlements within 500 miles, no Spanish missions, no documented Mediterranean immigration to these mountains. Yet here they were, entire communities of people who shouldn't exist according to everything he understood about American demographics. What William Grohse had discovered were the Melungeons, a mysterious population that had lived in complete Appalachian isolation for over 200 years, developing their own dialect, preserving unique customs, and creating a genetic legacy that would baffle scientists well into the 21st century. They were neither white nor black nor Native American in the way antebellum society understood those categories. They were something else entirely, something that challenged the very foundation of American racial classification. For the next 175 years, waves of anthropologists, genealogists, linguists, and eventually genetic scientists would attempt to solve the riddle of Melungeon origins. Were they descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke, absorbed into Native American tribes and emerging generations later in these mountains? Were they shipwrecked Portuguese sailors who had intermarried with local populations? A lost tribe of Cherokee who had somehow acquired European features? Turkish immigrants who had arrived centuries before official records? Or were they something far more extraordinary, living evidence of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the New? The theories multiplied, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the oral traditions of close-knit families who had learned that silence was survival in a society obsessed with racial purity. Stay with me until the end, because the Melungeon mystery reveals the most extraordinary truth about American identity and how modern DNA testing finally solved a 400-year-old puzzle that rewrote the history of early America, proving that this continent's story was always far more complex, far more diverse, and far more beautiful than the simplified narratives we were taught in school. Before we dive into one of America's most enduring mysteries, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard of the Melungeons before today. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering these hidden chapters of American history. To understand the Melungeon mystery, we must first understand a geography that protected their secret for 2 centuries. Newman's Ridge rises like a natural fortress in Hancock County, Tennessee, straddling the border with Virginia and Kentucky. This isn't the gentle, rolling landscape of popular imagination. These are the true Appalachian Mountains, steep ridges covered in dense hardwood forests, separated by narrow valleys called hollows that remain in shadow for most of the day. The terrain is so vertical that early settlers describe it as land standing on end. Mountain trails were treacherous even in good weather, impassable during winter or heavy rains. Blackwater Creek, Stone Mountain, and the surrounding peaks created a natural labyrinth where entire communities could exist virtually unknown to the outside world. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was strategic survival. The historical context is crucial. By 1795, when the first documented European contact with Melungeon families occurred, the young United States was already constructing rigid racial hierarchies. The 3-race model, white, black, Native American, was being codified into law, and anyone who didn't fit neatly into these categories faced legal and social catastrophe. Your racial classification determined everything. Where you could live, whom you could marry, whether you could vote, own property, testify in court, or send your children to school. The 1830s brought escalating crisis. Federal census takers fanned out across Appalachia with explicit instructions to classify every person into one of the approved racial categories. But what were they to make of the dark-skinned families on Newman's Ridge who owned property like whites, spoke English like whites, but possessed physical features that suggested something far more complex. Census records from this period reveal the confusion. The same families appear as free persons of color in one decade, mulatto in the next, sometimes Indian, occasionally even white. By the 1840s, Tennessee's Constitutional Convention was actively debating whether Melungeons should be granted citizenship rights. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In 1924, Virginia's Racial Integrity Act would threaten the community's very survival. As State Registrar, Dr. Walter Plecker launched an aggressive campaign to reclassify all Melungeons as colored, stripping them of every legal protection. The key players in this drama span generations. Vardy Collins, the mysterious Melungeon patriarch who appears in late 18th century records with no documented origin, claiming to be Cherokee but possessing distinctly non-Native American features. Mahala Mullins, the legendary Melungeon matriarch who lived from 1824 to 1898, weighing over 500 pounds in her later years and operating a successful moonshine business from her cabin, which straddled the Tennessee-Virginia border. When law enforcement came from one state, she would simply roll to the other side of her cabin to evade arrest. Dr. Walter Plecker represents the antagonist, Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics, who became obsessed with maintaining racial purity and viewed the Melungeons as a threat to his vision of white supremacy. And finally, Dr. Brent Kennedy, a Melungeon descendant who in the 1990s will revitalize academic and genealogical interest in his people's origins, using modern DNA testing to finally unlock secrets his ancestors had been forced to keep for centuries. The initial circumstances set the stage for everything that follows. The Melungeon community systematically refused standard racial classifications, insisting they were Portuguese or Turkish or sometimes Cherokee, anything but colored. They developed unique cultural practices that blended European, Native American, and unknown elements. Their dialect preserved linguistic features that linguists would later identify as Elizabethan English mixed with unexplained vocabulary. They maintained strict oral traditions about their ancestry, traditions that seemed fantastic but would eventually prove to contain kernels of truth. And they chose geography as their primary defense, retreating into hollows so remote that the outside world would simply forget they existed. This strategy worked for generations. But isolation comes at a cost, and the Melungeon community would pay that cost in genetic consequences we'll explore later in this investigation. The documented discovery of the Melungeons unfolds in waves, each generation of outsiders encountering the community with fresh confusion and speculation. The first substantiated contact comes in 1795, when a land surveyor working for the state of Tennessee ventured onto Newman's Ridge to establish property boundaries. His report, preserved in state archives, describes encountering families of dark-skinned persons of unknown origin who had established homesteads on the remote ridgeline. The surveyor noted that these individuals spoke English but with peculiar inflection and claimed to have occupied the land since before memory. This claim was remarkable. If true, it suggested these families had been in the mountains since before the American Revolution, possibly before European colonization of the region. By 1810, church records begin documenting baptisms and marriages. The entries are telling in their confusion. A Presbyterian minister in Sneedville records baptizing free persons of color with decidedly European surnames: Collins, Mullins, Gibson, Goins, Minor. These weren't African names or anglicized Native American names. They were English, Scottish, and Irish surnames. Yet the families bearing them were described as having swarthy complexions and exotic features. The 1830 federal census marks a turning point. Census enumerators were required to classify every individual by race, but the Melungeon families created an administrative nightmare. William Grohse 1848 encounter, mentioned in our opening, was neither the first nor the last time a government official stood before a Melungeon family with no idea how to categorize them. The physical characteristics defied simple classification. Olive skin that darkened in summer sun to deep bronze, thick dark hair that was sometimes straight, sometimes wavy, occasionally even reddish. Blue eyes appeared in some individuals, green in others, brown in still others. Facial structures varied from sharp European features to broader Native American characteristics to something that looked distinctly Mediterranean or even Middle Eastern. The cultural markers were equally puzzling. The Melungeon dialect incorporated words no linguist could identify. Family traditions included practices that seemed to blend Protestant Christianity with folk customs of uncertain origin. Names followed patterns that made no sense in the context of Appalachian naming conventions. Why did so many families use the surname Grohse, a name virtually unknown outside Melungeon communities? Why did certain given names appear repeatedly in the population, but nowhere else in the region? Their social status was perhaps the most confusing element. In the rigid hierarchy of antebellum America, the Melungeons occupied an impossible middle ground. They weren't enslaved and they owned property, attributes of whiteness. But they weren't fully accepted as white either, facing discrimination and legal challenges to their status. They weren't living on reservations or identifying primarily with Native American tribes, though many claimed Cherokee ancestry. They existed in a liminal space that threatened the entire structure of racial classification. As the 19th century progressed, encounters escalated in frequency and intensity. The 1840s saw Tennessee legislators actively debating Melungeon voting rights, with some representatives arguing that these mysterious mountain people couldn't possibly be citizens if their race couldn't be determined. In the 1890s, anthropologist James Mooney visited Newman's Ridge as part of his comprehensive study of Native American populations. His notes, preserved at the Smithsonian Institution, reveal his bafflement. These people claim Indian descent but possess physical characteristics inconsistent with any tribe I have studied. Their skin tone and facial features suggest Mediterranean ancestry, yet they insist their people have lived in these mountains for time immemorial. The community's response to outside scrutiny was consistent: create elaborate origin stories that would preserve their social status while deflecting deeper investigation. If claiming to be Portuguese prevented racial reclassification, they were Portuguese. If Cherokee ancestry provided legal protection, they emphasized Native American heritage. The Melungeons became expert at narrative adaptation, telling outsiders what they needed to hear while preserving the truth within their own families through carefully guarded oral traditions. By 1924, this defensive strategy faced its greatest challenge. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, championed by Dr. Walter Plecker, sought to classify all Virginians into two categories: white or colored. There could be no ambiguity, no middle ground. Plecker's office began systematically investigating families of questionable ancestry, and the Melungeons of Southwest Virginia found themselves in his crosshairs. Plecker declared that all Melungeons were to be classified as colored, regardless of their claims to Portuguese or Cherokee heritage. Birth certificates were altered, marriage licenses denied, school enrollment blocked. The community resisted through every available means. Some families produced elaborate genealogies tracing their lineage to aristocratic Portuguese families, documents that historians later determined were either fraudulent or impossibly vague. Others emphasized their Cherokee ancestry, though tribal authorities often refused to confirm these claims. Still others simply moved deeper into mountains, beyond the reach of census takers and birth registrars. By 1943, sociologist Brutenberry published the first academic study specifically focused on the Melungeons, bringing their existence to wider scholarly attention. His work, Almost White, documented their unique position in Southern racial hierarchies and sparked the first serious academic interest in their origins. But without genetic testing, the mystery remained unsolvable. The discovery phase reveals a community caught between silence and visibility, forced to tell just enough of their story to survive while concealing the full truth even from themselves. As generations passed and the original narrative became obscured by layers of strategic obfuscation. The serious scientific investigation of Melungeon origins represents one of the most complex interdisciplinary research projects in American anthropological history, spanning genetics, linguistics, archaeology, and historical documentation. The historical deep dive must begin 4 centuries in the past. One of the most persistent theories connects the Melungeons to the lost colony of Roanoke, the English settlement established on Roanoke Island in 1587 that mysteriously vanished by 1590. When Governor John White returned from England with supplies, he found the settlement abandoned with only the word Croton carved into a post. What happened to those 115 colonists has never been definitively determined, but linguistic and genetic evidence suggests that at least some survivors may have been absorbed into Native American tribes, their descendants eventually migrating westward into the Appalachian Mountains. Several pieces of evidence support this connection. First, linguistic analysis of the Melungeon dialect reveals archaic English phrases consistent with Elizabethan-era speech patterns. Words like afeared for afraid, yearn for yours, and grammatical constructions that died out in mainstream English by the 1700s persisted in Melungeon communities into the 20th century. Dr. Virginia Easley DeMarce, a linguist who studied Melungeon speech patterns, noted that their English resembled a time capsule of 16th century pronunciation and vocabulary. The genetic evidence grows more compelling with each study. Between 2000 and 2012, multiple DNA analyses examined Melungeon descendants, and the results were extraordinary. Y chromosome testing revealed that the vast majority of Melungeon men carried European paternal lineages, primarily British Isles markers, with significant Portuguese and Spanish contributions. This confirmed European male ancestry, but didn't explain the physical characteristics that set Melungeons apart. The mitochondrial DNA results, which trace maternal lineages, proved far more complex. Melungeon women showed genetic markers from three distinct populations: European, Native American, and Sub-Saharan African. But the proportions and specific markers suggested something unusual. The Native American markers weren't consistent with Cherokee or other regional tribes encountered by English colonists. Instead, they matched eastern seaboard tribes like the Croton and Lumbee, the very groups that likely absorbed Roanoke survivors. Autosomal DNA testing, which examines the entire genetic blueprint rather than just paternal or maternal lines, revealed the most startling findings. Melungeon descendants carry genetic signatures found in Mediterranean populations, specifically Turkish, Cypriot, and Portuguese groups. Some individuals showed markers associated with North African Berber populations. The genetic picture suggested a founding population that was already multi-ethnic before arriving in Appalachia, carrying mixed European, Mediterranean, and Native American ancestry. Dr. Roberta Estes, a genetic genealogist who has extensively studied Melungeon DNA, explains the significance. What we're seeing is evidence of a small founding population that was already admixed, already carrying diverse ancestry. They then married within their community for generations, creating a genetic bottleneck that preserved and concentrated these unique markers. This wasn't a single ethnic group that mixed over time. This was a mixed group from the very beginning. Archaeological evidence adds another layer. Excavations at historical Melungeon settlement sites have uncovered artifacts that shouldn't exist in 18th century Appalachia. Fragments of Mediterranean-style pottery, metalwork techniques consistent with Turkish or North African craftsmanship, and architectural features similar to Portuguese rural construction. While none of these findings are individually conclusive, collectively they suggest cultural influences beyond typical Scots-Irish Appalachian settlers. The historical documentation presents its own mysteries. Church records from the 1700s and early 1800s show Melungeon families appearing in parish registers with no previous documentation. No birth records, no immigration papers, no explanation of origin. They simply appear, already established, already intermarried into complex kinship networks. Land records show that some Melungeon families owned property before the American Revolution, yet there's no record how they acquired it or when they first arrived. Court documents from the 19th century reveal the community's desperate legal battles to maintain white status. In one 1872 Virginia case, a Melungeon man fought to overturn his classification as colored, presenting witnesses who testified to his Portuguese ancestry. The court record preserves testimony describing his dark but not Negro complexion and noting that his people have always been separate, neither Negro nor Indian but of foreign extraction. The court ultimately ruled against him, but the case reveals how Melungeons understood their own identity as a distinct ethnic group, not a mixture of existing American racial categories. Anthropological studies conducted throughout the 20th century documented cultural practices that set Melungeons apart. Their folk medicine incorporated herbal remedies unknown in standard Appalachian practice, suggesting Mediterranean or Middle Eastern origins. Their music included modal scales and rhythmic patterns that ethnomusicologists couldn't place in any regional tradition. Their foodways showed influences beyond Scots-Irish cuisine, use of spices, cooking techniques, and food combinations that suggested diverse cultural origins. The genetic mystery deepens when we examine population bottleneck effects. Because Melungeons married almost exclusively within their own community for generations, partly by choice, partly by necessity as outsiders rejected them, they experienced severe genetic drift. Certain rare markers became concentrated in their population, while genetic diversity decreased. This bottleneck has actually aided research, making Melungeon genetic signatures more distinct and easier to identify in modern descendants. By the 1990s, when Dr. Brent Kennedy began his research after being diagnosed with a rare disease more common in Mediterranean populations, the pieces finally started falling into place. Kennedy, himself a Melungeon descendant, brought fresh perspective and personal motivation to the investigation. His work, particularly his book The Melungeons, The Resurrection of Proud People, revitalized academic and public interest in Melungeon origins. The investigation revealed that Melungeons weren't a single mystery, but rather a convergence of multiple historical phenomena, survivors of the lost colony mixing with Native American populations, Portuguese and Turkish sailors from shipwrecks or early exploration, possibly even Ottoman prisoners released from Spanish ships, and enslaved Africans who had escaped bondage. These diverse individuals found each other in the Appalachian wilderness and created something entirely new, America's first consciously multiracial community, forced into existence by circumstances and sustained by isolation. The legal and institutional response to the Melungeons represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American racial classification history, revealing how pseudo-scientific racism was codified into law and deployed against communities that threatened white supremacist ideology. The crisis began in earnest in 1924 with Virginia's Racial Integrity Act, but its roots extend back to the antebellum period. Throughout the 19th century, Melungeon communities faced sporadic legal challenges to their status. Individual families would be hauled into court to defend their right to vote, testify, or attend white schools. Each case was adjudicated locally, with outcomes depending more on community relationships than any consistent legal standard. The 1924 Racial Integrity Act changed everything by centralizing racial classification under Dr. Walter Ashby Plecker, Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics. Plecker was a eugenicist who believed in the biological superiority of the white race and viewed racial mixing as a threat to civilization. He saw his position as registrar not merely as administrative, but as a crusade to protect white racial purity. Plecker quickly identified the Melungeons of Southwest Virginia as a primary target. In his view, they represented the worst possible threat, a mixed-race population that could pass as white, thereby contaminating the white gene pool through intermarriage. Between 1924 and his retirement in 1946, Plecker waged a systematic campaign against Melungeon families, using the power of the state to literally erase their claimed identity. His methodology was insidious. Plecker's office would research family genealogies, searching for any documented ancestor who had been classified as colored, mulatto, or Indian. If found, even if that classification had occurred a century earlier and possibly in error, Plecker would declare the entire family line to be colored under Virginia law. Birth certificates would be altered or annotated. Marriage licenses would be denied or revoked. School enrollments would be blocked. The bureaucratic violence was devastating. Families who had identified as white or Portuguese for generations suddenly found themselves legally classified as colored, with all the attendant consequences in Jim Crow Virginia. Children were expelled from white schools. Marriages were declared invalid. Property rights came into question. Some families were actually forced to move to colored sections of their counties. The Melungeon response was multifaceted and increasingly desperate. Some families produced elaborate genealogies claiming Portuguese noble ancestry, documents that historians now recognize as either fabricated or based on impossibly thin evidence. Others emphasized Cherokee connections, though regional Cherokee authorities often refused to confirm tribal membership. Still others simply fled, migrating to West Virginia, Kentucky, or Ohio, where racial classifications were less rigorously enforced or where their families were unknown. One of the most significant legal challenges came in 1943, when a Melungeon family named Sorrells sued the Wise County, Virginia school board for excluding their children from white schools. The case, though ultimately unsuccessful, brought Melungeon existence to wider public attention and generated the first detailed legal record of their physical characteristics, cultural practices, and claimed ancestry. Witness testimony described children with olive complexions, dark hair, and European features who spoke English properly and conducted themselves as white children. The court nonetheless ruled that the children, having been classified as colored by the state registrar, could not attend white schools. Academic intervention provided some relief. In 1943, sociologist Bruton Berry published his landmark study, Almost White, documenting the Melungeons and similar isolated triracial communities throughout the South. Berry's work established the Melungeons as a legitimate subject of academic inquiry, though his conclusions, that they were simply a mixture of European, Native American, and African ancestry, didn't satisfy Melungeon descendants who insisted their origins were more complex. The 1960s brought new hope through the civil rights movement. As legal segregation crumbled and racial classification lost much of its legal force, Melungeons faced less overt discrimination. However, social stigma persisted. Many Melungeon families had spent so long concealing their identity that they had internalized shame about their heritage. Younger generations often knew they were different, but didn't understand why or couldn't get older relatives to discuss it. The breakthrough began in 1994 with the first Melungeon Heritage Association Conference, organized by Dr. Brent Kennedy and other researchers. Over 600 people attended, far exceeding organizers' expectations, demonstrating the hunger for information and community among Melungeon descendants. The conference launched a wave of genealogical research, oral history collection, and eventually genetic testing. DNA testing in the early 2000s provided the scientific validation that legal systems had never offered. When genetic analysis confirmed significant Mediterranean and Middle Eastern ancestry in Melungeon populations, it vindicated generations of family oral traditions that had been dismissed as fantasy. The findings were published in respected genetic journals, giving Melungeon heritage academic legitimacy. By 2008, comprehensive genetic analysis had been published in academic journals, and major genealogical databases began including Melungeon lineages in their reference materials. Ancestry testing companies started recognizing Melungeon genetic signatures and could identify likely Melungeon descent in their customers' DNA profiles. Legal recognition followed scientific validation. In 2012, the state of Tennessee officially recognized Melungeon contributions to state history, designating Newman's Ridge as a historical site worthy of preservation. Virginia, which had done so much to damage Melungeon communities through Plecker's campaigns, issued formal acknowledgement of Melungeon heritage as part of the state's diverse history. Universities established research programs specifically focused on Melungeon studies. The University of Virginia, located in the state that had most aggressively persecuted Melungeons, created an oral history project to record the testimony of elderly Melungeon descendants before their memories were lost. Archaeological surveys located and excavated historical Melungeon settlement sites, recovering artifacts that help reconstruct their material culture. The legal and intervention phase reveals how state power was weaponized against a community that threatened racial orthodoxy, and how the community ultimately achieved recognition not through legal victory, but through scientific proof that circumvented the entire framework of racial classification. The aftermath of the Melungeon Mysteries resolution represents a remarkable transformation, from a community forced into silence and shame to one celebrating its unique heritage as a source of pride and a lens for understanding American complexity. Identity resolution came through multiple converging streams of evidence. The DNA confirmation was perhaps most powerful because it was irrefutable. Genetic testing of Melungeon descendants consistently showed the same pattern: European Y chromosomes indicating European male ancestors, mitochondrial DNA showing Native American, European, and some African maternal ancestry, and autosomal testing revealing significant Mediterranean and Middle Eastern genetic signatures. This wasn't one person's anomalous results. This was a consistent population-wide pattern. Dr. Roberta Estes, who has tested hundreds of Melungeon descendants, explains the genetic signature. When we see Portuguese markers combined with British Isles markers, Native American haplogroups consistent with Eastern seaboard tribes, and then these Mediterranean and Middle Eastern signatures that appear across multiple family lines, We're looking at a founding population that was already mixed before settling in Appalachia. The genetic bottleneck from generations of endogamy preserved and concentrated these markers, making them identifiable centuries later. Historical validation accompanied genetic proof. Genealogists working with newly digitized historical records began tracing Melungeon family lines backward with unprecedented precision. They discovered documentary evidence supporting family oral traditions that had been dismissed as fantasy. Portuguese sailors had indeed been shipwrecked on the Carolina coast in the 16th and 17th centuries. Ottoman prisoners had been aboard Spanish vessels plying Atlantic trade routes. English colonists from Roanoke did interact with and likely join Native American tribes. All the elements of Melungeon oral tradition found support in historical records. They just hadn't been connected before. Cultural recognition followed swiftly. In 2012, the Melungeon Heritage Association established a formal organization with nonprofit status dedicated to preserving Melungeon history and supporting genealogical research. The organization maintains an extensive database of Melungeon family lines, helps descendants research their ancestry, and coordinates annual gatherings that now draw thousands of participants. Educational programs have proliferated. Several universities now offer courses specifically on Melungeon history and culture. East Tennessee State University established the Melungeon Heritage Project, which includes oral history collection, archaeological research, and curriculum development for K-12 education. High schools in the Appalachian regions where Melungeons remain concentrated now include Melungeon history in their standard curriculum, a dramatic shift from decades of silence. Community transformation has been profound. Newman's Ridge, once a place Melungeon descendants were reluctant to discuss, is now a heritage tourism destination. The Vardy Community Historical Society maintains a historic Vardy school, which served Melungeon children in the early 20th century, as a museum and cultural center. Visitors can walk the same mountain trails Melungeon families used for generations, see reconstructions of their homes and farmsteads, and learn about their material culture and daily life. Cultural festivals celebrate Melungeon identity in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The annual Melungeon Heritage Gathering features traditional Appalachian music with presentations on Melungeon-specific musical traditions, genealogy workshops where professional researchers help attendees trace their family lines, DNA testing services provided by genetic genealogy companies, and presentations by scholars researching various aspects of Melungeon history and culture. The genealogical resources available to Melungeon descendants have expanded exponentially. Online databases now include digitized records from counties throughout the Appalachian region where Melungeon settled. Professional genealogists specializing in Melungeon family history offer services to help descendants overcome the brick walls created by inconsistent racial classifications and name variations in historical records. Genetic genealogy has proven particularly valuable, allowing descendants to confirm family connections even when paper trails were destroyed or never existed. The broader historical impact extends far beyond the Melungeon community itself. The Melungeon story has fundamentally altered understanding of early American demographics. The traditional narrative presented American colonial settlement as distinct waves of European immigration, Native American populations, and enslaved Africans brought from Africa, three separate populations that only mixed in later periods. The Melungeon evidence proves that complex admixture was occurring from the earliest colonial period, that multiracial communities existed before the American Revolution, and that America's genetic diversity is far older and more complex than previously understood. The challenge to binary racial classification has profound implications for how we understand race itself. The Melungeons existed for centuries in a liminal space that white supremacist ideology couldn't accommodate. They were neither white nor colored in the way those categories were legally defined, yet they clearly existed. Their presence revealed the fundamental arbitrariness of racial classification, that these categories were social and legal constructions rather than biological realities. Research outcomes continue to multiply. The genetic databases established through Melungeon research have proven valuable for other studies of population genetics and human migration. Methodologically, the Melungeon case demonstrates how combining multiple research approaches, genetic, genealogical, linguistic, archaeological, and historical, can solve mysteries that any single approach cannot. Academic recognition is now secure. Melungeon studies is recognized as a legitimate academic field, with peer-reviewed journals publishing Melungeon-related research and conferences dedicated to Appalachian studies regularly, including Melungeon content. The transformation from a community dismissed as delusional or willfully misrepresenting their ancestry to one whose history is preserved in academic literature represents a complete rehabilitation. Educational initiatives ensure the next generation understands Melungeon contributions. The Melungeon Heritage Association offers scholarships to descendants pursuing higher education, particularly in fields related to Appalachian studies, genetics, or history. These scholarships not only support individual students, but ensure that Melungeon perspectives are represented in academia. The broader recognition has practical benefits. Melungeon descendants who previously concealed their heritage now openly discuss it. Some have used DNA testing to confirm family oral traditions, found relatives they didn't know existed, and connected with a broader community. The psychological impact of this transformation, from shame to pride, cannot be overstated. The legacy of the Melungeon mystery extends far beyond a single community's identity resolution. It fundamentally challenges how we understand American origins, racial classification, and the very concept of American identity itself. The long-term impact continues to evolve. From 2010 to the present, genealogical and genetic research has only intensified. Commercial DNA testing companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and Family Tree DNA now include Melungeon genetic signatures in their reference databases. When customers receive results showing Mediterranean or Middle Eastern ancestry, combined with British Isles, Native American, and Appalachian geographic markers, these companies can now flag potential Melungeon heritage. Thousands of Americans have discovered through DNA testing that they have Melungeon ancestry, even when their families had lost or suppressed this knowledge. The cultural revival among young Melungeons has been extraordinary. Rather than viewing their heritage as something to conceal, millennials and Gen Z descendants embrace it as a source of unique identity. Social media groups dedicated to Melungeon heritage have thousands of members sharing family stories, posting historical photographs, comparing DNA results, and planning gatherings. This generation is reclaiming and celebrating what their grandparents and great-grandparents felt forced to hide. Historical accuracy has improved across multiple domains. Textbooks in Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky now include sections on Melungeon history when covering early American settlement and Appalachian culture. The narrative of American colonization is becoming more nuanced, acknowledging the complex interactions and admixture that occurred from the earliest periods. Museums throughout Appalachia include Melungeon exhibits, and the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina, now discusses Melungeon connections to eastern seaboard tribes and possible lost colony survivors. The Melungeons have become a model for other multiracial communities, seeking recognition and understanding of their unique heritage. Similar isolated groups throughout the South, the Lumbee of North Carolina, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina, the Red Bones of Louisiana, the Carmel Indians of Ohio, have followed the Melungeon example of combining genealogical research with DNA testing to document their distinctive origins and challenge simplified racial categories. The broader implications for American identity are profound. The Melungeon story demolishes the myth of racial purity that undergirded white supremacist ideology. It proves that America has been multiracial not just since the Civil Rights era or since waves of 20th century immigration, but from its very founding. The genetic mixing that created Melungeons occurred in the 1600s and 1700s, not the 1900s. America was never racially pure. It was always a meeting place of diverse peoples creating new identities. The genetic ancestry implications extend beyond American borders. The Melungeon genetic signature, particularly the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern markers, has sparked renewed interest in pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas. While mainstream historians remain skeptical of claims about Turkish or Portuguese settlements in pre-colonial America, the genetic evidence is undeniable. These markers exist in populations that were already established before the American Revolution. How and when they arrived remains an active area of research, but their presence is no longer disputed. Cultural survival against overwhelming odds is perhaps the most inspiring aspect of the Melungeon legacy. For 2 centuries, this community maintained its identity despite legal persecution, social discrimination, geographic isolation, and intense pressure to assimilate. They developed strategies for cultural preservation that balance survival with authenticity, telling enough of their story to explain their difference while concealing enough to avoid catastrophic consequences. The oral traditions they maintained, even when they seemed fantastic, preserved truth across generations when written records were unavailable or unreliable. The challenge to arbitrary racial categories has legal and social policy implications that continue to resonate. The Melungeon case demonstrates how racial classification has always been arbitrary, how it shifted to serve political purposes, and how it failed to describe human genetic reality. As America becomes increasingly multiracial through intermarriage and immigration, the Melungeon experience offers historical perspective on how multiracial identity has always been part of the American story. Policy changes stemming from Melungeon research include historical recognition at state levels, with Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky all officially acknowledging Melungeon contributions to their states' histories. Cultural protection efforts have designated Melungeon settlement areas as historical sites worthy of preservation. Educational reform has integrated Melungeon history into standard curricula. Genealogical access has improved through public funding for digitization projects that make historical records more available to researchers. Dr. Brent Kennedy, whose research helped revitalize Melungeon studies, reflected in a 2020 interview on what the resolution of the Melungeon mystery means. Growing up, we knew we were different but couldn't explain why. My family had these vague stories about being Turkish or Portuguese, but we had no proof, no validation. When I got sick with a rare disease more common in Mediterranean populations, I started asking questions that led me down this path of discovery. The DNA testing didn't just solve our mystery. It revealed that America's story is far more complex than anyone imagined. The Melungeons were an anomaly. We were America's first multiracial community, living proof that this continent has always been a meeting place of cultures. Our ancestors couldn't tell their true story because society wasn't ready to hear it. They developed this brilliant survival strategy of partial truth and strategic silence. Now we can honor their courage in preserving who they were while surviving in a world that demanded they be something else. Every time someone discovers their Melungeon heritage through DNA testing and reaches out to our community, I see the healing that comes from finally understanding your own story. Genealogist Jack Goins, whose own family has been central to Melungeon research, offered his perspective in a 2021 interview. Every DNA test we do adds another piece to the puzzle. We've traced our lineages back to Portuguese sailors who survived shipwrecks off the Carolina coast in the 1600s, to Turkish or North African men who may have been Ottoman prisoners released or escaped from Spanish vessels, to Native American women from eastern seaboard tribes who were displaced by colonization, to African survivors who had escaped bondage. The Melungeons proved that American identity was never pure. It was always mixed, always complex, always more interesting than the simplified stories we were taught. What's remarkable is how our ancestors managed to preserve this complex heritage through oral tradition, even when it was dangerous to discuss openly. My grandmother would tell me we were Black Dutch or Portuguese, but wouldn't elaborate. Now I understand she was giving me the pieces she could, while protecting me from the full truth that might have endangered our family's social position. That generation carried a heavy burden of silence. We're finally free to speak openly about who we are and where we came from. The cultural legacy manifests in tangible ways throughout Appalachia. The Melungeon Heritage Center in Sneedville, Tennessee, opened in 2019 as a museum and research facility. The center houses an extensive archive of Melungeon family histories, photographs, artifacts, and genealogical resources. It serves as a gathering place for descendants and a destination for researchers from around the world. Interactive exhibits allow visitors to explore Melungeon genetic heritage through DNA visualization, trace family connections through digitized historical records, and experience reconstructions of Melungeon daily life in the 18th and 19th centuries. Academic programs dedicated to Melungeon studies have proliferated. The University of Virginia offers a graduate certificate in Appalachian studies with concentration in Melungeon history. East Tennessee State University's Melungeon Heritage Project continues to expand, conducting archaeological excavations at historical settlement sites and building one of the most comprehensive databases of Melungeon genealogy in existence. These programs ensure that Melungeon history is not merely preserved, but actively studied and taught to new generations of scholars. Professional genealogical services specializing in Melungeon ancestry have become a cottage industry. Researchers who understand the specific challenges of tracing Melungeon lineages, the name variations, the inconsistent racial classifications, the destroyed or altered records, help descendants overcome obstacles that would stop amateur genealogists. Some descendants have discovered that their ancestors appear in records under 3 or 4 different surnames and racial classifications within a single generation, requiring expertise to confirm identities and trace connections. The annual cultural events have evolved into major gatherings. The Melungeon Heritage Association Summer Event now draws over 3,000 participants from across the United States and even international visitors. Workshops cover everything from advanced DNA analysis to traditional Melungeon crafts to historical research methodologies. The multi-generational nature of these gatherings is particularly striking. Elderly descendants who grew up concealing their heritage share stories with young people who wear their Melungeon identity with pride, healing generational trauma through connection and celebration. The historical significance extends to multiple academic disciplines. For anthropologists, the Melungeons demonstrate how isolated populations can preserve distinctive genetic and cultural traits across centuries. For geneticists, they provide a case study in population bottlenecks, genetic drift, and the persistence of rare markers. For historians, they challenge conventional narratives about colonial settlement, racial classification, and American demographic development. For sociologists, they illustrate how marginalized communities develop survival strategies and maintain identity under oppressive conditions. The lost colony connection, while still debated in details, has gained substantial support from multiple evidence streams. Genetic markers consistent with Eastern Seaboard Native American tribes, linguistic features from Elizabethan English, family traditions about being here before the settlers came, all point towards the Melungeon ancestors being descendants of Roanoke colonists who were absorbed into Native American populations and later migrated westward. This connection, if fully confirmed, would mean that Melungeon families carry living genetic links to one of America's most enduring historical mysteries. The proof of colonial-era diversity is now indisputable. The genetic, genealogical, and historical evidence conclusively demonstrates that complex multiracial communities existed in America before the Revolution, before the Constitution, before the racial classification systems that would attempt to erase them. This finding has profound implications for how we understand American origins and challenges the melting pot metaphor that suggests mixing occurred primarily in the 19th and 20th centuries. Cultural adaptation strategies developed by Melungeons offer lessons for other marginalized communities. The balance between preservation and concealment, the use of strategic storytelling, the importance of geographic isolation for maintaining group identity, the role of endogamy in preserving distinctiveness. These strategies enable Melungeon survival when assimilation or elimination seemed inevitable. The challenge to founding narratives is perhaps the most culturally significant legacy. The traditional story of America as a nation founded by English Protestants, with other groups arriving later and gradually being incorporated, cannot survive the Melungeon evidence. America's founding populations were already diverse, already mixed, already creating new identities that defied old world categories. The Melungeons were doing in the 1600s what America as a whole would claim as its defining characteristic centuries later, bringing together people from different continents and cultures to create something new. As we conclude this investigation, one final reflection seems essential. The Melungeon mystery took 400 years to solve, but its lessons are timeless. In their mountain isolation, these remarkable people preserved the truth about America's complex origins, a truth that society tried to erase through racial classification and cultural pressure. When census takers demanded simple answers, when laws required binary choices, when social survival depended on fitting into acceptable categories, the Melungeons navigated an impossible situation with remarkable ingenuity. They told partial truths, emphasize acceptable aspects of their heritage, and preserve the full story in oral traditions passed from grandparents to grandchildren in quiet moments when outsiders weren't listening. Today, as we use DNA to unlock the secrets of human migration and identity, we must remember the Melungeons and their courage in maintaining their heritage against overwhelming odds. They survived by becoming invisible, by letting the world forget they existed, by accepting marginalization as the price of maintaining their unique identity. Now, as their story emerges from shadows into light, we see that they were never the anomaly that white supremacist ideology claimed. They were the truth that ideology tried to suppress, that America has always been multiracial, always been complex, always been more beautiful in its diversity than the simplified myths we created to replace reality. The Melungeon story proves that American identity was never simple, never pure, and always more remarkable than we imagined. Their DNA carries the genetic signatures of continents and cultures that met in these mountains centuries ago. Their survival demonstrates that identity is not erased by silence, that truth persists across generations, and that eventually science and scholarship will validate what oral tradition preserved when official records lied. We want to hear from you in the comments. Did this story change how you think about American history? Have you discovered unexpected diversity in your own ancestry through DNA testing? And most importantly, are there other hidden communities whose stories deserve to be told? Your engagement helps us continue uncovering the forgotten chapters of American history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep investigations into mysteries that shaped our nation.